Hi, my name is Oliver Aces. I'm a professional photographer based out of San Diego, California. I specialize in weddings, portraits, landscapes, and architecture. I've been doing photography for over the last 10 years. It's been a lot of fun, and over the next couple days, my hope is to teach you everything that I know about photography. Even though I've been as a photographer for the last 10 years, there's still a lot of learning that I have to do. But I'm definitely going to do my best to teach you everything that you need to know to get you on the right foot as you begin your photography journey. So join me as we discover, learn, talk, and discuss about photography. Over the next couple of days, we'll go to topics such as things that you need to know, the foundational photography topics, the type of equipment that you might want to consider when building up your photography gear or wanting to purchase for the first time. We're also going to talk about the idea of editing and why you might want to edit or not edit, and some of the tools that you might want to use when editing your photos. And lastly, if you decide that photography is something that you're interested in and you want to take it to the next level, such as starting a business or a side hustle, or just diving deeper into the hobby and craft of photography, we'll be talking about that as well. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the photography lessons that we're about to embark on. And I hope that after all of this, that you can take those images that you want and that you envision and create them your own way with your own camera. So let's begin. Here's the first lesson of photography, and I want to teach you about the basics. We're going to go all the way back and learn about some of the basic things to consider in photography. One of those most basic things is the idea of exposure. And for the purposes of this lesson, we're going to talk about exposure in terms of how bright or how dark your photograph is. And on top of that, there are some different aspects of photography that are important to the exposure. And these are what I'm going to call the 3 pillars of photography. And those 3 pillars are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go deeper into each of those topics with the goal in mind that you can gain an understanding of how they all affect each other, how you can use it, and how you can take that information and help craft those images that you want to create. So one of the first things I want to cover in today's lesson is one of those pillars. It's shutter speed. Shutter speed has the ability to change the brightness of your photo. It can make your photo bright or dark. It also creates dramatic effects of freezing action or blurring action. The shutter is referred to by the camera curtain that is in front of your sensor. It's that click that you hear. And when it clicks, it's either opening or closing. Shutter speed, for the most general purposes, is the length of time the shutter is open that allows the light to hit the sensor. It is what makes your images brighter or darker. Long shutter speeds definitely make your images brighter, but they also have that effect of blurring the motion. The blur of that motion is in the direction of travel, and in some advertising photography, for example, that blur gives the communicated idea of motion and speed. That's why sometimes if you look at car photography, you'll find that those cars are moving and has that emotion because it conveys that idea. But it can also be used differently. For example, in landscape photography, motion is used to kind of show the movement of water. So the water is moving and it looks a little bit more blur, while the landscape around it, which is not moving, is still tack sharp. Now that brings me to the opposite extreme, fast shutter speed. Fast shutter speed has the ability to freeze the motion. One of the best ways to see how a fast shutter speed actually works is in a drop of water. Try to imagine a single drop of water. You know it's moving fast, so you really need a fast shutter to stop that action. Shutter speed is measured in a fraction of seconds. For example, a quarter of a second is a lot slower than 1/250th of a second. In most cameras, such as a DSLR, you can have the max of 30 seconds. However, if you do have an external remote or another ways of means, you can change your camera settings to have longer exposures. And that's what they call in camera talk the bulb mode. And you can have your exposures go as long as you can. In general, shutter speed allows you to stop the motion, blur the motion, and allows you to change whether your image is brighter or darker. So now that we've talked about one of the first pillars of photography being shutter speed, the next thing I want to talk to you guys about is the second pillar of photography, and that's aperture. Aperture refers to the opening in your lens that controls the light that enters your camera. Aperture adds dimension to your photos by controlling the depth of field. You can get a shallow focus where your background is blurry, or you can also get a sharp focus where your foreground and background is all in focus. It also controls the brightness of your photo. Similar to shutter speed, aperture also does that. A large aperture allows for a lot of light, and a small aperture limits the amount of light entering your camera. Depth of field is the amount of sharpness in your photograph from the front to the back. So a shallow depth of field is when your front element is sharp and your background is blurry. And a deep or large depth of field is when your object in front is sharp as well as your background is sharp. Aperture is also expressed in terms of an f-stop or an f number. And basically the way it is, small numbers represent a larger opening and large numbers represent a smaller opening or an aperture. So the way you kind of look at this is think of it as f2.8. Usually when photographers talk about apertures, we put an f in front of it. And an f2.8 is much more larger than an f4. And the technique that works really well to memorize this is remember it in terms of fractions. So 1 over 2.8 is a lot larger than 1 over 1/4. So aperture allows you to control the exposure, meaning the brightness of your photo, through the size of that opening in the lens. But it also has this ability to control the depth of field. And depending on that depth of field, you can either, isolate a subject or make that subject part of the whole entire scene. So those are some of the basic things about aperture that you can do to improve upon your photography. But next, we're going to move on to the last pillar of photography, and that's ISO. So one of the last things I want to talk to you about today in the terms of the pillars of photography is ISO. ISO basically tells your camera how bright or how dark to make an image. Lower ISOs generally tend to be darker images, whereas high ISOs tend to be a lot more brighter images. ISOs can help you in different situations and environments. For example, in a nighttime setting, you can shoot at higher ISOs and still get a good exposure. Whereas in sunny situations, you might want to shoot at lower ISOs, so therefore you can still equally get that right exposure for the photograph. But one of the things that you want to note about ISOs with your digital camera is that lower ISOs, you tend to get a little bit more darker images, but you don't get as much grain. In comparison, when you go photograph in with higher ISOs and you zoom in, you can see the grain in the images, which sometimes can make an image unusable. Or if you shoot with a high ISO during the day, you may be shooting that photograph overexposed, which also might make it unusable. So you might be asking yourself, but what does ISO mean? ISO means International Organization of Standardization. technically most of the cameras are not related to this organization, but it's been adopted as part of the vernacular that photographers use. One of the myths about ISO is that ISO doesn't really tell you about the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Basically what ISO does, it basically communicates to your camera about how bright and how dark to make that image. Basically your sensor is only sensitive to light in the same regard. It doesn't matter what ISO you shoot it at. It just basically tells your camera, okay, I need to make these images darker or brighter depending on what ISO settings that you use. So in general, most cameras have a base ISO, and a base ISO is basically the lowest ISO possible. Most cameras that you use today have a base ISO of 100, and from there you can add more. Some cameras have 50, some have 200. It just depends on the manufacturer and the type of camera that you use. So what I just covered right now are the three basic pillars of photography that are the basis for all of the images that you are going to create over the next couple days and as well as on your journey with photography. So you might be asking, okay, how are they all related? Well, they are all related because they all each influence one another. For example, ISO is going to influence what aperture and shutter speed you use dependent on the environment that you're in. So for example, if you're out on a full sunny day, one of the things that you might want to do is set your ISO to a base ISO of 100, meaning that your image is a lot more darker to begin with. So what you do then is that you either will then use the aperture or shutter to determine how bright you want to make that image. So for example, if you want to make that image brighter through through the shutter speed of the camera, you're going to make that shutter speed, a lot more, you're going to make that shutter speed slower. So for example, when you are out on a bright sunny day, you're going to have to you might want to set your ISO to 100, a base ISO. So therefore your image is going to start off dark. So now you have to make the decision of which of the other two are you going to choose next. And you can choose either one. So for this example, we're going to choose shutter speed. And you might want to change your shutter speed to, 1/50th, because that's going to make your image a lot more brighter. Now, if that image is too bright, then you have the ability to choose your aperture to bring it down. So let's just say your aperture is open wide at f2.8, so that's going to let in a lot more light, so you might want to make that aperture a lot more smaller, so you might bring it down to f8. So therefore therefore the exposure in that photograph is perfectly exposed. And basically all you're trying to do is you're trying to play a balance between those three things. So you're always going to set your ISO, you're going to set your shutter, and you're also going to set your aperture. And in most cameras, if you look towards the bottom or if you look on your menu screen, you'll see an exposure bar. And basically, dependent on what side of that exposure bar your camera's, the arrow is pointing to, it's gonna either tell you your photograph is underexposed, meaning it's darker, or it's gonna be overexposed, meaning it's brighter. And if you get it right in the middle, that's when you get like what most photographers call a perfectly exposed photograph. But then again, it is generally up to you as a photographer to decide what is the appropriate exposure. Because basically, as a photographer, all you're trying to do is you're trying to capture an exposure for a certain scene. And there are some scenarios that you might want to consider when deciding what type of ISOs, shutter speeds, and apertures to use. And I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to talk about that right now. So one of the first things to consider with those pillars that I just talked about is a great example. So a great example in terms of trying to determine what is an appropriate setting to use for a certain situation. So let's take the idea of a portrait, for example. So the way to look at it is that the portrait is all about the person, and the background is there to support the person. So, with that idea, you know for sure that your subject is going to be the focus of that image. So you want to make sure that subject is focused and not the background. So what are you going to do with that? If you said to make your aperture a shallow depth of field or an f2.8 or a wide aperture, you are correct. Because what that does, it allows your subject to be in focus while that background just to play a supporting character. Whereas if you made that aperture a lot more smaller, your subject would be in focus, but then the background would also be in focus, and you would basically kind of lose that subject. The subject would not stand out as much. So now, with your subject in focus, let's say it's at a wide aperture, so therefore your subject is in focus and the background is blurry. Now you can play which setting you're going to do next. So I would go with the route of ISO as next, because therefore you can determine whether you want your image to be brighter or darker. And you can use either your aperture or your shutter to compensate for that. So let's say you have it at f2.8 and then you go to your ISO, you set it to 100, so that's going to be darker. And you look at your exposure bar on the bottom and you confirm that it is darker. So the only thing left that you have is now you have your shutter speed to play with. So if the image is too dark, the next thing that you might want to do then is to make your shutter speed, a little bit more slower. So you might want to shoot it at 1/100th versus at 1/400th of a second. See what I'm getting at? Because as you set each thing, you're going to move to another thing and you can compensate for each and every one of those settings. So your shutter speed, your aperture, and ISO all play a role, and all you're trying to do is gain that perfect exposure. Now let's talk about a situation in which now your shutter speed is long, but now your aperture is also small. So that leaves your ISO to be determined. So in a situation, if you are in a situation like most landscape photographers find themselves, especially when photographing at night, you're going to need a shutter speed of 30 seconds to capture the scene, because it's relatively dark, there's not a lot of light, but how do you capture that scene? So one of the first things that you want to do is set your shutter speed to, set your shutter speed to about 30 seconds, right? So therefore you give your camera 30 seconds to take in as much light as it can. Well, now if you want to get more light quickly, what you can do then is you can play with your aperture. You can have an open wide aperture at f2.8, which will allow a lot of light to come in at 30 seconds. And once that is set, then you play with your ISO, so therefore it keeps it at the exposure that you want it. So your ISO can now be set at ISO, for example, 800 versus 100, because if you set it at 100, that means it's going to be even more darker, and that means either you're going to have to recompensate that setting based off of your shutter speed or your aperture. So I know I may have said a lot there, and I may have lost a few of you, but basically the way to look at this is that your shutter, your aperture, and ISO form a trifecta that controls your exposure. And in some circles we call this the exposure triangle. And trying to master these three things takes some time and takes some experience. So don't feel worried right now about if you don't fully understand what I just talked about. One of the best things that we have today that I didn't have so much when I began my photography career is we have all the information you could ever want out on the internet. So if there are any topics that I've been discussing so far that you're not getting, I highly recommend to go ahead and Google it and try it and see to gain more information. Because like I said at the beginning, even as a photographer that's been with this for 10 years, I'm still learning a lot of things as well. And I always refer to the internet to help me figure out some things to understand photography. And I promise you, if you keep at this and you keep doing this, it will become second nature, to the point that sometimes you'll just know exactly what to do in a certain situation. So those are the basic core principles of photography in terms of just kind of like the more technical stuff about it. So what I want to talk to you guys next is some more basics about photography, and we're going to talk about compensation, and what we're going to talk about is the idea of composition. Alright, so now that you have the basics, the 3 pillars of photography set in play, or at least gain good understanding of it, which is shutter, aperture, and ISO, which equals exposure, the next thing I want to talk to you about is exposure. The next thing I want to talk to you about is composition. And basically, composition is how you arrange objects and horizons and verticals in your image. And one of the core principles in composition is a guideline. I call it a guideline, even though the name of it is called the rule of thirds. It's only a rule, the way I look at it, it's only a rule while you're learning it. But once you understand it and fully grasp it, make it a guideline. Because it doesn't always apply to every situation. But in general situations, it's going to work. So basically what the rule of third tells you, and I'm going to draw it for you. So I have a handy dandy pad right here. And what I'm going to draw for you is what a sensor looks like, right? So basically this is what the sensor looks like in your camera when you look through your viewfinder. So what the rule of thirds tell you is to separate your field of view into 9 equal areas. I'm going to try to do that right now. So there's one, there's another, and there is another line. So as you can see, it's now separated into 9 different squares. So with the rule of thirds, what you want to do is, if you're looking at a landscape, we're going to use a landscape for this example. So if you're looking at a landscape, you might think to put, the horizon right down the middle. And that is not wrong. However, if we're following the rule of thirds, what the rule of thirds will tell you is you can either put your horizon down here at the bottom third, or you can put it here at the top third. It depends if you have, the reason why you want to put it in a top third is if you have an object that is of focus here, you can put it down here. Or if you don't have a very flattering foreground, you can put your horizon here, and it's all about that sky that you get here. So a rule of third kind of tells you that in terms of a landscape. You can equally do that too when you take a vertical image and apply it here. So if you had a mountain here, you can put it towards this line and also here. So it just kind of depends. So one of the things about the rule of thirds is, dependent on the subject that you're photographing, you may want to consider putting your subject on what they like to call the power points. The power points are basically where these lines intersect, and there's 4 power points in a composition in the rule of thirds. And those are going to be right here, right here, right here, and right there. So those are 4 power points in the composition of your image. So say for instance you have a barn and mountains in the background. So what you're going to want to do is you can either put your barn in one of these 4 places, and you can put the mountains in the background on the top third, or if you put it here, you can put it on this top, or anywhere. So what you're going to try to do is you're going to try to walk around your landscape to put your subject in one of these power points. And the reason why you want to do this is that generally your eye will look at these images in a rule of thirds kind of way, and it just looks more pleasing to the eye. So it's all about trying to please that eye to make your viewer want to look at your images even more. So the rule of thirds allows you to, put your horizon here at the top third or the bottom third, and put your, subjects at one of these power points. So that is covering the rule of thirds in terms of composition. So the other thing to think about too, I'm going to put that away for now. The other thing to think about too in your composition that you might want to use is using lines. So, you know, have lines guide your eye through that whole entire image. So I'm going to bring this back out. So let's just say, for instance, I just quickly talked about lines, but let's just say you have a line and you want your subject to kind of travel through it. And let's just say you have, you have mountains here and all that, and you have an object here. Well, how do you connect your object here to these mountains? You want your viewer's eyes to travel. So if you happen to find like either a road or a path that leads to it, so therefore your eye will naturally want to follow that path, and so therefore you create a path there and your eye will follow it, and therefore you can have your viewer go deeper into your photograph. So the use of lines definitely helps, and they can either be straight lines that converge together, or what's even more aesthetically pleasing are S-curves, like nice gentle curves that really work, just like this. It works really well in imagery and all that. The other thing when you are composing your image, like for example, we're going to switch gears. We're going to go from landscapes to portraits. One of the next things to consider when you're taking your portraits, in terms of just composing it, you can definitely keep your subject right dead in the center, just like, this video. But you can equally move your subject to the side. And when you do that, you just have to have a reason for it. There has to be some type of element here that allows for that subject to be towards the side. So, play with it. We're going to have an assignment for this lesson that you're going to experiment and try these things out. The other thing too to keep in mind when taking portraits is look around your subject. Like, look around their heads, because there have been a lot of times where I myself have taken portraits and then I bring it back and look into the camera later, and I find out that there are things sticking out their heads. Like, right now there's not too many things going on. I'm pretty sure if you're watching this computer screen here is kind of a little bit distracting. I think you most likely would prefer to kind of have my head a little bit more isolated from that. But those are things about like composition that I'm trying to say. But also, you don't want to have like branches or things sticking out of the head that doesn't make sense. So look around your object when you're also taking portraits as well. Those are some of the basic things with composition. But like I said earlier, these are just like the rule of thirds and all those are just general guidelines. Like, the best thing that you can do to begin is to just try sticking to those rules. See what images you can create and see, if you can push your creativity to make it work. Now, after a while, you might want to start pushing the limits. Now, I know earlier I was talking about a landscape image and I said that most people want to put the horizon right down the center. And I said, it's not wrong, but generally you want to stick to the rule of thirds. But if the subject basically allows you, or basically the subject kind of calls for it down the center, put it down the center. The most important thing as a photographer is to be happy with the images that you create. Just because there are rules like the rule of thirds or compositions or PowerPoints that you have to kind of adhere to, generally you don't have to. It is your responsibility as the photographer to visually tell the story that you're trying to capture. So have fun with these compositions, try them out. There's a lot out there. Like I said in the last segment, take some time out of your day to look up some compositions, look at imagery, and try to figure out how the rule of thirds applies to them. There's a whole lot of information out on the internet about composition, and we can have all these days just talk about composition and look at that. So that is just another basic thing that you want to consider in starting out your photography. You might already know some of the information that I just dispelled, but it would be good to practice it. So basically, as you can see, what we've talked about in this first lesson are the basic things about photography. and let's do a quick review about it. So some of the basic things that we talked about today are exposure and shutter speed, aperture, ISO, composition, the rule of thirds, PowerPoint, using lines, thinking about how your subject looks, thinking about looking around your subject. Those are some of the basic concepts that you can build upon as we go further, deeper into photography. So basically, that concludes lesson 1 of the photography course. And now what I want to talk to you guys about is some things to experiment with and try yourself to photograph it. So one of the assignments that I want you to do for this particular day is I want you to experiment with exposure. So if you can, try to capture an image that is dark, try to capture the image that is bright, and try to capture an image that's in the middle. And simply just go find a dark image, a super bright image, and a perfectly exposed image. Just go ahead and take that. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to go out and experiment with aperture. So aperture is that setting in your camera that controls the amount of light that enters your camera. And I want you to go out there and photograph things at a shallow depth of field, a deep depth of field, and generally a middle depth of field. The next thing I want you to try to do is capture an image that plays with shutter speed. So try to get a blurry image, see if that's possible, and then try to get an image that freezes the motion. And try with all of those with your exposure, your aperture, and your shutter speed to see if you can make images dark and bright. Also, while you take these images, apply the principles of composition. So the rule of thirds, those PowerPoints, try to compose an image that allows for that to happen. And lastly, what I want you guys to do is also play around with the camera's ISOs. So play with a ISO that is low and an ISO that is high. And I know I didn't talk about how to play with these or how to change these in your camera because everyone has a different type of camera and everyone has a different type of camera system, and they're not all equal, and you might even be using your mobile phone. So I don't know what camera that you are using or planning to do this assignment with, but refer to a manual or even just Google it to see how you can change each of those things. So, you know, your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, see how your camera does it. I can definitely tell you how Canon's change it, because I photograph and use Canon equipment, so that works. But I would definitely recommend also, as a good assignment, you don't have to do this because it's going to take a little bit longer, but also if you do have your camera manual, read it. Read it almost kind of just like a book. Read it per chapter. I know some camera manuals are like large and long, but I promise you, if you read it, it's gonna give you all the ins and outs of that camera. And that's one of the also things that you want to do as a photographer, is understand the tool that you're using. So read that manual. It's one of the best things that you can definitely do. Alright, so that covers lesson 1. I hope you have fun with your assignments, but I also hope that you have learned a lot today and that you are off to a great start with your photography career here. So we're gonna end today, but we'll be back tomorrow and we'll talk about other things related to photography. So until then, happy photographing and have a lot of fun. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.